PhD in Progress, Episode 4. This week we talked to Zack about taking a leave of absence, self-education, and preparation for consulting job interviews. Let's go! Daily show when you're like senior, whatever, or any. Yeah.
Our illustrious producer, Jason.
Producer and caterer.
Where's the food? I didn't know there was lunch.
I'm not good at catering.
I catered myself. I'm gonna Diet Coke.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the PhD in Progress podcast, where we talk about your education, your career, and your life. I'm Jason.
Hi, Jason. I'm Nikhil.
Hi, Nikhil.
Hey.
What's up?
What's
Come here
up?
often?
Do I come here often? I come here once a week to do this podcast thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And what's up, Abigail?
Oh, hi, I'm Abigail.
Yep.
I handed in my dissertation. It was actually due last week on the day that you guys were recording, so I actually handed it in about 4 days later, which I think is fairly standard.
Standard enough.
And then I went home and had a nice dinner with my husband. We watched episode 1 of Game of Thrones, which I hadn't watched yet.
Me too. I just watched episode 1 like last week.
I mean season 3. But I read all the books.
Never
Yeah,
mind.
I know you're starting from the beginning.
Oh, never mind.
But I
Take it
watched
back.
a television program, which I have not permitted myself to do for a long time, and I went to bed at like 10:30. And then I slept in. It was great. And now I still have a ton of stuff to do.
You're back here.
I'm back here.
So this week is a milestone for me as well, though not as big as Abigail's. I wish I was in her position. But this week is my last week of actually doing experiments in the lab.
Well, I'm still doing experiments.
Oh.
So
That's what they all say.
I'd rather have my dissertation done. But yeah, I mean,
Congrats.
I hope to never do another experiment.
I hope
Good
that
luck
for
with
you
that.
as well.
Okay.
I don't
Good
wish
luck.
that upon anyone.
I mean, okay, in this lab. I want that for the rest of my life, but
Cool.
what do you do this week?
So last week, I had my final committee meeting where they were like, you can graduate September 1st projected date. And I was like, yes, I'm out of here and getting on with my real life and real job, which I do not know what is happening. I don't have a job lined up like Abigail does. So we'll see. That's a whole other journey. But now I'm finishing up experiments to finish my first but fairly big first author paper.
High five.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you. So that's going to take a lot of work, but my boss was like, all right, so once we submit this paper, you can take a vacation. And I was like, yes.
Are you going to go to Japan?
Oh, man, I would love to go to Japan. Don't have the money for it right now.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, that's been happening in our lives. And hopefully you, listener, are enjoying your life as well.
This week we're introducing an idea we have of doing a case study. So in this scenario, graduate school is the problem. Haha.
Well,
Well,
problem.
it's sort of a problem. There's more than one solution, though. There are a number of ways you can get through your graduate school experience. And so today we're going to talk to Zack about his experience and the challenges he encountered and his way of thinking about it and dealing with it and his way of coming up with a plan for his life. And so our interview with Zack today should help you think about how to think about both graduate school and your experience and what you want.
Meta thinking.
Meta thinking all around. Very meta.
Okay, let's get on with it.
Let's do it.
I'm Nikhil. I'm here on behalf of the PhD in Progress podcast, and I'm with Zack Donnell. So, Zack, tell me a little bit about who you are and what you study.
Sure, no
Just
problem.
an introduction.
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student in molecular biology. So I study mainly bacterial genetics. So I study how bacteria talk to each other using small molecules. Mainly I work on the bacteria called Vibrio cholerae. It causes the disease cholera. And so I'm studying just a specific gene regulation mechanism in this bacteria.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, what year are you in your...
That's a good question. I guess I'm a 6th year. I might be a 7th year. But I took a year off kind of in the middle of my PhD. But I guess technically I'd be a 6th year right now. But this is my 7th year of being here in grad school.
Okay, so that's interesting. You said you took a year off of graduate school. So what made it... First of all, when did you take a year off in your course of study? And what motivated you?
So I took my year off halfway through, I guess it would be it was my 2nd or 3rd year. I guess probably halfway through my third year, so 2.5 years into grad school. And I guess looking back, I took a year off for a lot of reasons. One of them was that I just realized that, partway into my PhD that kind of my plans had changed. For most of my life, I'd wanted to be a professor. And I think 2.5 years in, I realized this is just not what I want to do. And so I was still really interested in science. I was still really interested in research, but I knew that my career plans were going to be dramatically different than what I had initially intended.
So sorry to interrupt, but I guess that's the point, is for me to interrupt you.
It should be a conversation.
It's a conversation, yeah. So you mentioned that, so you realized that this career path of being a tenure track professor wasn't for you. Is there any specific reason for this change of heart?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's a lot of reasons. I think one of the main ones was that I had realized that oftentimes when you go into academia, you end up focusing on one specific problem, and you do that for decades. I mean, this isn't always the case, but it's often the case. You'll have professors that are, doing some kind of research, and, they make a big discovery, and they kind of base their tenure on that, and they end up following up on it for a long time. And so I felt like I wasn't sure that I wanted to work on the same problem for that long. I've been working on the current problem for about 2.5 years, and realized that I don't know if I could necessarily make a career out of something like that. And so I wanted to find something that was, I guess, a little bit more dynamic, had a lot more change going on in the job.
And would you say your advisor was supportive of your decision to take time off?
Yeah, definitely. I think I was very lucky in that regard, because I think different professors will give you, a lot different response. I mean, luckily my lab's very well funded, so that really wasn't an issue. And I think my lab's also very big, so having one person leave your year wasn't going to have like a massive change. It's not like you're one of 2 or 3 grad students. We had probably in the order of 15 or 20 grad students and postdocs. So that was one reason, just like the diversity of problems. I felt like I didn't want to kind of pigeonhole myself that way. I think another reason was I just didn't like the kind of growing competitiveness in academia. So from what I saw, years ago, you could do, a very short PhD and get a job as an assistant professor, or sometimes not even do a postdoc at all. But I feel like nowadays it's getting very common to do at least, a 5-year postdoc, maybe 2. And even then, it's still, even if you do stellar work, it's very competitive still to get a job at a good university or, research center. And I just didn't like the kind of the hyper competitiveness. I didn't like the fact that you have to continually apply for grants. And so these things kind of turn me away from academia. And I think the thing is, it's hard to know this without actually having the experience. I think that I had to come to grad school to kind of realize this. I think if I had not gone to grad school in the first place, I never would have known these things. I would have assumed that, it's this great, job. But
so if you were given the opportunity to do it all over again, you would definitely come to grad school?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't really regret my decision coming to grad school, because it's kind of what I had planned since I was like in 2nd grade when I decided that I wanted to be a scientist. Like I knew for a long time, and that was always, my goal. And, I get up to where I'm like, 24 years old, and I realize this is what I thought my entire life is actually not really what I want to do.
Okay. So what did you do in your year off? How did you occupy your time?
So I'd done photography and videography just kind of as a hobby for a long time. And I basically just decided to take the plunge and try to monetize that. I'd gotten a lot of requests for, people wanting me to shoot, events or engagements or weddings. And so I basically just started to try to live off that. So pay for rent, pay for food, and a little bit extra, just based solely on my hobby.
So you started a company essentially. That's just yourself.
Yeah, that's right. So it's sole proprietorship.
Okay. Is there anything else you did? Like, did you continue? Yeah. Did you have like a program for self-education, or did you do science?
I did. So I did a little bit of everything. I think I used my business just to kind of support myself. But I would say maybe out of a given week, I was only spending 10 days, or sorry, out of a given month, I was only spending a third of that month actually doing the business. And so one of the benefits of doing this year off is I just had a lot of free time to pursue things that I'd never been able to pursue before. So I'd basically been in school my entire life. Ever since I was 5 years old, I'd been in school every year. And this is my first time to like not really have any of those constraints.
And you went straight through, right, from undergrad to graduate school.
That's correct.
So that's a long time for just straight school. So would you say that
I was basically like in my almost like my 19th or 20th year of school.
But would you characterize this as like sort of mild burnout, like that you were tired of doing the school thing, or was this more like I think you wanted to do something else?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think a lot of these questions don't really have a definitive answer. There's a lot of reasons behind all these things. I think, for me, especially my first couple of years actually working in the lab were pretty rough. I think, as a scientist, as a, kind of a budding scientist, it's often hard to tell if you're doing something wrong or if the experiments just aren't working. And so, early in your scientific career, you're often very cautious and very, not very confident about your skills. And so I had, a couple of years straight where things just weren't working. And I wasn't sure if I was just doing something wrong or if the experiments were really telling me something. And, it's rough to have something like that happen when you go, you're working almost every week of the year, 40 to, 80 hours sometimes, 40 to 80 hours a week in lab. That's, to have that keep going on and on and on for weeks on end and then having nothing to show for it is pretty rough. And so I think I had reached a point in my project where I had to do something drastically different. And it was a good kind of stopping point to kind of take a breather, I think. So I think it was mildly burnout, but also I had all these other things that I wanted to pursue at the same time.
Yeah, that sounds like it was really productive. So can you, did you accomplish anything like really you did start your own business, but like if you were to summarize your year off, what would you say you accomplished? And then, what did you learn from the experience? Yeah. So what did you take away from the whole thing?
So I think part of it was I just wanted to experience a lot of things that I kept telling myself that I didn't have time for. And so I took a lot of classes in New York. So I would take, for a couple months, like 3 classes a day, different parts of New York. And just, I think that's one thing that I'd always wanted to do, and thought that I would enjoy, but never had time for. Just, taking community classes and things like that.
So, for example, like what did you take?
So I started so my year off started in June, and for June and July of that year, so I would go to New York in the morning and I would take dance classes at the Broadway Dance Center. In the afternoon, I would take Krav Maga classes. These are kind of like hand-to-hand combat classes. And in the evening, I would take improv comedy classes at the People's Improv Theater, the Pit. And, just basically push myself out of my comfort zone and just tried totally new things that I'd never tried before. After that, I took a photography class at the School of Visual Arts. And then I visited China for 5 weeks. So my wife, who is my girlfriend then, lives in Shanghai. So I was able to go there and kind of travel around China for a little while. I had a undergrad working with me in lab. And so I was able to still kind of get some experiments in during my year off, but I didn't actually have to touch a pipette, which was nice. So I kind of set it up to where, I had some kind of preliminary questions that I wanted to ask about this project. I wanted to see if it was feasible. And instead of having to wait the entire year to see if the project was actually going to pan out, I was able to work with someone else to kind of see if the project was worth pursuing.
Wow, that sounds really amazing. I mean, not only did you continue to do science, but you also traveled quite extensively and tried to learn many different things, like you said, that were way outside of your comfort zone. You're quite the Renaissance man, and that leads me sort of to the next.
Well, if I can just interject for a second,
sure.
I think what's funny is though, I think one of the main things that I realized was that, you have these plans for I'm going to go do this and this and this, and you're like, oh, I just don't have time for it, and then you get this opportunity where you have all the time in the world, and there were some things that I still just didn't pursue. and it kind of made me realize that even when I'm super busy and I'm working, 40 hours a week, saying, "Oh, I'm too busy" is not really a good excuse. Because even when I had just all the free time in the world, there were still some things, like I bought like an oil painting set. I bought the brushes, the paint, the canvas and everything. And it's been sitting in a closet ever since that year. I just never got to it. And there's a certain level of activation energy for all your hobbies. And, I think at some point, if you find that you're telling yourself that, oh, I just don't have enough time for this, that's probably not true. It's probably just that you need to take the first step and start trying something out. And it's like, if you do something for 5 minutes, typically that's like, I feel like the activation energy for something. If you work on something for 5 minutes, you'll probably keep working on it for a couple hours.
So the moral of the story is just to dive in and then see if you like it.
I think so. If there's something that you're kind of interested in, see if you want to actually pursue it. Don't keep waiting and thinking that you just don't have time for it, because it's just not true.
Make time for it. Take a year off.
Well, but you don't have. That's my point, though. You don't even have to take a year off. You just have to realize that it's not that you don't have enough time. Usually, it's just that it kind of sucks to take that first step. And if you put in just the minimal amount of effort to get it started, usually if it really is interesting to you, you'll keep pursuing it.
Okay, great. So you're, as you mentioned before, you're a 6th-year student, and so that means you're finishing up your PhD pretty soon. And it sounds like you have a very diverse set of interests. Mm-hmm. So how do you go about thinking about your future? And you don't want to be a tenure track professor. So how do you go about thinking about and structuring your career exploration and your career search?
The way it worked for me is I initially got interested in business solely because I'd started a sole proprietorship. I had to set up the business if I wanted to make money off of it, but it wasn't like the business wasn't the whole point of doing the photography. And so, but it forced me to learn all these things about business. It forced me to learn how to apply for a business and get the bank account going and all these little things. And the more I thought about it, the more I kind of got interested in the business side. And so I'd been going on for about a couple months, and I just happened to start reading about consulting. I knew that a lot of PhD students went down the career route, but I didn't really know what it was. I just knew that it existed, and it kind of existed in the realm of business.
So, what is it for those? For those of you out there who don't know what consulting is, or have heard the term but aren't familiar with it, you're about to hear.
It's a lot of pressure.
What Zack thinks it is.
Well, I think. Well, first of all, there's a lot of different types of consultants. I mean, a consultant is basically a rent-a-brain. You're someone who. Someone in a certain industry might trust for advice. And so there's a lot of different types of consulting. I think probably the most, maybe the most popular, the highest paying is called strategy or management consulting. This is the one that I'm particularly interested in, but this is where you are basically advising the heads of companies. So oftentimes members of the board, the CEO, people like this, not always, but sometimes. And it's basically trying to help these people make decisions about, large scale decisions about the course of a business. So what it's going to do in the next 1, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Do you have an example of the kind of problem that a management consultant would solve? Sure. So, I mean, I'll give you a couple different examples. So one might be a business comes to you and they realize that they lost a lot of profit last year and they want to see how they can turn their profit around. Very broad question like that. Or maybe a company comes to you and they're thinking about entering a new market. They want, they're based in the US, but they're thinking about selling in China. Should they do this? Or something like, a business has invented a new product. How much should they price it for? How much, what's the dollar value they should put on this product? Very, very broad, but important business decisions that are going to kind of shape the course of a company. And you mentioned that this is specifically management consulting. What other types of consulting are there? So there's things like IT consulting. There's, I guess you could call it kind of like specialty consulting. Basically, you have a lot of knowledge in maybe a certain area. So for instance, you could be a biotech consultant. I guess you can basically work for a boutique firm that specializes in one specific type of problem and gets really good at that one problem. So it's kind of like more of a focused thing than kind of the generic strategy consulting.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so you alluded earlier that one of the reasons why, you weren't so keen to pursue the tenure track route was because you end up going in depth on one problem for essentially your entire career. Is the reason you're pursuing management consulting because it gives you a broad variety of problems to solve, or is there something more than that?
That's definitely part of the reason. I think what I like about consulting is that, the typical job is going to last on the order of weeks or months. And so you work on something really hard for 2 months, and then you're done and you move on to the next thing. And it could be like the next thing, like a completely different industry or a different size company. The questions that you're going to be solving and the people you're going to be working with can be totally different, the next week. And so that really appealed to me because I think, again, that's like one of the reasons I loved science so much before grad school is that there was like an endless number of topics and, physics, chemistry, biology, all these diverse topics you can go into in these different subjects. But once you're actually working in the lab, it's kind of like the same question over and over and over again with very few variations. And so I guess like learning about consulting, it kind of reminded me of the interest I had in science, when in high school and college.
Mm-hmm. And one of the trends is that these management consulting firms tend to hire from a very diverse pool of candidates.
Yeah, that's right.
So they'll choose not just PhDs, but also people with MBAs or people with real-world business experience.
Yeah. So McKinsey calls them APDs, or Advanced Professional Degree. So basically, if you want to apply, so just take McKinsey for example. The lowest level of worker there is going to be someone called like a business analyst, and you can become a business analyst right out of undergrad, and that's mainly who they take. But if you want, if you want to go up to the next level, you have to have an advanced degree. So this is someone with a PhD, a JD, an MD, anything like this, or specifically, most management consultants are MBAs. But you have to have one of those advanced degrees to start at that second level, the associate level, and only from there can you actually work your way up through the company.
And so are you worried that you don't know enough about business or that you haven't experienced enough of that, that sort of, quote unquote, real world or corporate world?
I've actually studied a little bit with MBAs, and I think that the type of question they ask in the case interview and I guess the things clients really ask on the job, they're not something that you're necessarily going to learn directly in business school. I don't think you necessarily have to have a business degree in order to understand them. If you can understand like chemistry, biology, or physics, I think, it's going to be accessible enough for you.
Let me ask the question a different way. How does having a PhD prepare you, or does it prepare you to be a management consultant?
I think it depends. I think having anything with a quantitative background is definitely going to help. I think specifically they're looking for people, in the sciences, and not always. You don't have to be from the sciences, but I think that definitely helps. They want people that have looked at graphs on a daily basis or looked at charts on a daily basis for years. And thought about how to construct, complex models based on hard data. But I don't think, ultimately when it comes down to it, they're looking for someone who does really well on the case interview. If you can do well on the case interview, then that means that you know enough. I mean, I wouldn't, if you are really interested in management consulting as a career choice, I would say then go for it. There's nothing holding you back.
One of the things I've noticed is that academics tend to have a very anti-corporate culture.
That's true.
And a lot of people would say that going into management consulting is selling out. So what do you think about that? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I disagree. I mean, I think that I don't know if this is the best way to put it, but I think the academic background is a little bit overrated. I think that I should probably say it a different way.
Well, essentially, you're trying to say like, no, I don't think I'm selling out because I think that whole mindset is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This dichotomy between academia and the real world, or academia as a bubble, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
it's just a hard.
I know it's a hard question
to answer. Well, I mean, I don't mind. It's just like it's like, are you a sellout? It's like
accusing.
No, it puts me on the defensive a little bit. It's like,
yeah, just channel your inner Robert S. McNamara. It's
yeah. So I mean,
I personally, I don't think it's selling out. The reason I don't think it's selling out is because I think that there are legitimately interesting problems that you can solve. And
well, I think that academia has, it's a little self-important. I think that academics often think that we're the best, almost like how could there be anything better than this? And they kind of look down upon business a lot of times. Like it's less intellectual, which I don't think it is. I think that's one of the things I like about consulting is it is kind of, a very problem-oriented and intellectual part of business.
Right. So there is that sort of creative problem-solving.
Oh,
aspect
definitely.
That's clearly something I think that drives a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
But you identified something really interesting, which is that academics have this sort of sanctimonious, holier-than-thou attitude.
Not always. I mean, I don't want to generalize too much, but I've definitely come face to face with that in grad school. I've seen that firsthand.
And maybe this is just my own personal experience, but I feel like the attitude towards consulting is maybe even worse than the attitude towards the sort of general business world.
Well, look at Office Space, right? Like, weren't the consultants they're kind of a plot device where they're kind of like seen as the bad guys by the other people in the business. I think part of that reason is, you're helping, like oftentimes you're helping a company be profitable, and maybe the best way to be profitable is to lay off 5,000 employees, and your job as a consultant is to tell a CEO that, if it's to tell them how to best run the company. And if your decision is to lay off people, that's like, it has a lot of real world consequences. And so I think,
so they're paying you for your objectivity,
exactly,
and your analytical skills.
No, that's totally true. I mean, that's part of the reason that they hire outside consultants, right? They want, oftentimes when a company hires consultants, they've already come to a decision internally. And it's almost as if they're bringing someone else to see if they come to the same conclusion. They give you the data, but they don't tell you necessarily how they're thinking about it. And if you reach the same conclusion as them, that, you should price something a certain way, or, you should not move into a certain market, if that lines up with what they had already seen internally, then means it's probably a really good decision.
I mean, it could also just be confirming a bias. I mean, you said
Sure.
that, so that to me, I mean, that sounds kind of like the opposite of the way we're trained to do science, in that, you're given your conclusion before you even look at any of the evidence.
I don't necessarily know, but I'm just giving an example of how consulting can work. But I think, oftentimes the client just doesn't know what to do. They know that there is a problem. They knew that, last year they made $1 million and this year they lost $4 million. And they know that something went wrong and they're trying to figure out what it is. And so I think it is a lot like science in the aspect that you're working with hard data, you're working with numbers, but there's tons of unknowns out there.
Mm-hmm.
And your ultimate goal is to make a sound decision, make a sound hypothesis, or, ultimately a conclusion based on kind of this big world of uncertainty based on the facts at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, that kind of the scientific background really comes into play.
Right, maybe even more than an MBA or another professional degree.
To an extent. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately consulting firms are looking for people that can teach themselves. If you're working for a company that is doing something with, nanotechnology, they expect you to be able to read the literature and learn it. And so that's why I don't think it doesn't matter that much what your background is, because as long as you're smart enough to learn the material when you need to, that's all they care about. They want people that they can kind of fit any mold.
I think a lot of the friction that academics have towards consulting has to do with the high pay or the amount people are compensated for the jobs.
That's true.
And I think that there's a similar attitude towards other high-paying professions, like working in finance on Wall Street, for example.
Well, it's almost as if sometimes I feel like academics feel like their profession is more pure, like almost, like the businessman is somehow, I don't know, tainted in some way. Don't you feel like that?
I think that's absolutely true. I think that
like their ultimate goal is the pursuit of knowledge, right? And they're solely trying to benefit humanity. I feel like is the not too far off from the mindset of a lot of academics. I mean, I think it's bad to generalize, but this is an attitude that I've come across many, many, many times in my life.
I think that's true. I think a lot of academics try to downplay the sort of financial side of things, or that, even the idea that money can influence their work. Mm-hmm. But it's absolutely true. I mean, if you look at the whole grant funding process, right? Clearly, the academic output is influenced by the grant funding agencies.
Sure.
Right. So
that's totally true. I mean, if you have 10 times more money, you can do 10 times more experiments, right?
Right. So is the business world really less pure than academia? I mean, that's a interesting discussion question, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's a weird question. It's hard to answer, but I think, well, anyway, you can stop after this.
No, it's fine. I think we're doing quite a bit of philosophizing here, but ultimately, this podcast is meant to provide actionable advice to our listeners. And so I wanted to ask you, Zack, what are you doing to prepare for this transition into consulting? How do you go about, studying for case interviews, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll say is that if you're going to go down this route, start early. There are basic types of questions that you have to answer in an interview, but I think there's an infinite number of variations, and you want to practice a lot beforehand. So, I mean, mainly what I've been doing so far, I've been listening to audiobooks about strategy consulting while I do lab work. So, one that I can really recommend is called The Lords of Strategy, and that's basically just a book about the history of strategy consulting. So I listened to that first. I started reading kind of like the I guess you could say the classics on strategy. So mainly stuff from Michael Porter. So there's a book, Competitive Strategy, and I think it was released in 1980, and a book called Competitive Advantage, which was released in 1985. And these are kind of like, the basis for, modern strategy consulting, positional, strategy. And so I was kind of reading the background, but then also reading books specifically on preparation for the interview. And I think the book that's most highly recommended is a book called Case in Point. And this kind of lays out, what an interview is going to be like, and the specific things you need to know in the interview. And so the first kind of step is just, for me at least, is just to give myself background on what are the ideas behind the cases, and then how did the cases actually proceed.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of like exploration and learning.
Yeah. Basically the fundamentals. I think, again, I think my advice should be taken with a grain of salt because I'm applying this fall. So whether or not my strategies on how to apply work or not are yet to be seen. But I think that I'm trying to take like a kind of a disciplined approach and just, learn some of the things that you might learn in an MBA. Kind of put myself in the same kind of business footing.
But like you said earlier about sort of just jumping in, I mean, you've also been practicing cases, right, with other people?
That's right. I mean, I think ultimately what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to provide myself with a background currently. But the next thing that you really want to do, that you have to do if you want to do well in this interview, is actually practice cases with, a friend. Or with most universities have consulting groups or, clubs that where you can find people to practice with. But the only way that you'll do well in this interview is if you just practice a ton of cases and kind of have a kind of a natural sense for it.
Do you think that there's a right answer to case questions or case problems?
Yes and no. I mean, I think on one hand it's open-ended, but I think oftentimes they choose cases that have kind of an obvious answer. or like, maybe not obvious, but it has like only one possible answer that you could possibly come to if you reasonably consider all the data. I think that there's the thing is that there's a lot of different types of questions that a consultant could get asked, and they try to cover all the different possibilities. And so part of what's difficult is there's like an infinite number of variations on the questions, and you can't prepare for everything.
So do you adopt like a particular framework? Like I know that McKinsey has this idea of MECE, which stands for
it's mutually exclusive, comparatively exhaustive.
Completely exhaustive.
Completely exhaustive. That's right.
So what does that mean? That means that you consider all the possibilities, but you also ensure that each possibility doesn't overlap with the other possibilities.
Yeah, basically, it's the most efficient way to solve a problem. So most ways that you kind of solve a case are by following, or inventing your own framework. And so basically, it's just like a decision tree. And it's like, should we do this or should we do this? Or we should consider these two factors before we do the next thing. And it's like a logical way to examine the problem. I mean, I guess maybe the best way to explain this is just to go into the case itself and how you would basically approach a case. Is that fine?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So so the interviewer, there's the kind of the behavioral part of the interview, which maybe we can get to later. But for the case part, they'll just ask you a question that a client would ask you. So I think, like we talked about before, like how to price a certain product. They'll ask, our client invented this new thing, but they don't know how much they should charge for it. And like, can you help us out? And they want to see if you can have a logical framework for how to answer that problem. And so the first thing that you would do is you would repeat the question back to them just to make sure that you understand everything. And they'll say, yes, that's right. And then the next thing you want to do is you want to ask a couple of clarifying questions to make sure that you're understanding the problem correctly. After that, you'll take a moment and write down a decision tree that is kind of going to be your logic for solving the case. And then you'll start talking to them, and then you'll go down each specific branch on the tree and address questions from that branch. And then after that, there'll be a lot of discussion back and forth on the case. And then ultimately you'll kind of synthesize the case and conclude, and that'll be the interview.
Okay. And in addition to the case interview, can you give me an idea of what the recruiting process is like? So how do you go from being a PhD student in the academic bubble to working for this company?
Well, there's a couple different ways. I mean, I think most universities are going to have kind of like recruiting events where current consultants or HR people will come down and basically inform students about the company. That's one way. There's also summer programs. So the year before you apply, you can work at a thing. So for instance, there's one called McKinsey Insight or Bridge to BCG for Boston Consulting Group. There's other summer programs for boutique firms as well. But this is just a way, if you can apply to this and try to get in and learn more about the company by working with people that are actually working there. I think also just reading up on the internet. There's a lot of websites about the application process. The firm websites themselves are pretty informative. And then you can also just try to seek out people that have worked there before. So maybe go on your career services contacts list and see if anyone has worked at those companies and try to email them.
And one of the things that I've always wondered about is, it seems to me like the business world speaks a very different language than the academic world. So how do you go about learning the jargon and learning how to talk like a business person?
I think part of it is just reading a lot of business text. Like, again, like this competitive strategy, competitive advantage, that's, that clues you into a lot of, phrases that business people use. And I think it's just, you have to become acquainted with that side of it. Also reading things like microeconomics textbooks, just to know, specific vocabulary that they might use. I think a lot of it is just experience and kind of, it's not like you can just memorize a list of words that, like a glossary of words that come up in business. You just have to have repeated experience with them.
Mm-hmm. My understanding is that the consulting world also has a culture of competitiveness, not just in the interview process, but also, once you're part of the company.
I agree. I mean, I think maybe I overemphasize that with academia, but I feel like with academia, it's kind of more stretched out over time, right? Like there's competitiveness at a multitude of levels. Like getting the job in the first place is super, super competitive. And I feel like a lot of the result is going to be based on luck. You know, there's every professor that you see that is doing really well is a combination of three things. They're very intelligent, they're very hardworking, and they're very lucky. And I think there's a lot of people out there who maybe didn't run into the same luck, but tried just as hard and were just as intelligent as people that are currently professors. And I felt like with the consulting, it was a lot more based on just the merit. It's how well can you crack this case? How efficiently can you crack this case? And so I felt like luck wasn't as much of an issue. But you're right, it is very competitive. But I could be wrong, but I feel like more of the competition is actually getting into a firm. And then once you're there, you know, then we'll see. You know, the average amount of time that someone's a consultant is 2 years. And so I think a lot of times people voluntarily will leave if it's not for them.
Right. And they, you know, as an outsider, consulting firms seem a little bit cultish. Like you definitely feel like you belong to an organization. And that's probably a good thing. You know, you do a lot of things besides just science. So you're involved in a lot of science communication, not just your videography, but also some other projects that you've been working on. So can you talk a little bit about those things?
Sure. So one of the things that I've been working on a lot recently actually is this art exhibit called Art of Science. And so this is kind of an annual competition and exhibit for found art that is kind of presented in part of an art gallery. And I've been working on this mainly with a professor and lecturer at my university and with the head of the engineering new media director at the university. And basically every year we just put on an art show with images that were found in the process of scientific discovery. And so we're about to have I believe this is the 7th exhibit this May. And so currently we're kind of looking through images that were submitted this year, deciding the winners, the people that are actually going to be at the exhibit, raising money for this event, and finding judges to actually judge who's going to be for second and third place in the exhibit.
I mean, it's clear to me that you're really passionate about this science communication thing. Did you ever consider pursuing a career in that area? Or what made you choose consulting over that?
I have like a lot of things that are like hobbies, but I don't know if I would necessarily want to do them for pay, right? Like I feel like, especially with something like photography, after doing it for a year, it's a lot less fun when you depend on it to pay rent and to eat. You know, I think, and with something like science communication, I just felt like I want to keep my business life and my hobbies separate. And so I enjoy doing it, and I like to do it, you know, kind of on my own terms.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, for me, I feel like if I were to depend on playing music as a source of income, it would kind of cheapen the whole endeavor. And
well, it's not even that for me, it's not that it cheapens it necessarily. It's just that, you know, it's kind of like whenever you were in high school and you got assigned a book to read in English class, and even if it was like a really good book, like 1984, it's kind of annoying to be having, you know, you're forced to read that book. And so it's a lot more enjoyable when you can do it on your own terms. And I feel like, you know, a hobby is kind of the same thing. It's enjoyable, but whenever you have to like wake up every morning and you depend on doing this certain thing in order to like pay rent, it becomes a lot less fun, you know, pretty quickly.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to start to wrap things up now. Zack, thank you very much for your time and this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. I wanted to ask you one more question, though, before we left, which is, do you have any advice for your second or third year self as a graduate student?
That's a good question. At this point, I'm happy with taking a year off. So I would say, you know, do everything that I'd done before, but maybe make a couple adjustments. I think I was on the right course, but, you know, like I mentioned before, if you have something that you're interested in, don't wait, just start on it. the only thing that's holding you back is just, kind of procrastination.
Inertia,
getting the project started. And then I would say, don't take your research too seriously. Grad school is kind of a weird couple of years, and I think it's just better to kind of relax and take it in stride and don't try to force it. It's easy to say, I'm going to work, 12 hours for the next 5 days and I'm going to get this really good result, because oftentimes that's not the way it works. And so, I think I would say, slow it down and don't burn yourself out.
Okay, that's great advice. Talk to you next time.
All right, thanks.
So that was a really interesting conversation between you, Nikhil, and Zack, and I think I learned a lot about consulting in general. It's been one of those things Zack kind of mentioned earlier on before we went too much into consulting. He said that it was this kind of amorphous kind of career path that he didn't know much about, and I think he covered a decent amount of different ways to learn about it and the way he's going about it. What did you take away from it, Nikhil?
Well, first of all, a disclaimer. I think that Zack's story is his own, and his grad school experience reflects his decisions and life choices, and is not really, I don't know, generally applicable to everybody's graduate school experience. So when you're looking at a case study like we did with Zack's grad school, what you take away isn't necessarily specific actionable advice on what to do in your own life. It's more about learning how to think about the problem and frame it and make decisions in a sort of broad context.
Yeah, it's not the view of this podcast that you all need to take a leave of absence and then go to China and take all these awesome courses like Krav Maga. You don't need to do this. If you're enjoying what you're doing right now and you think it's the way you should be going, please go along with it. I've had a great time in grad school, and I hope other people are too, and that's kind of why we're doing this podcast in general, right? It's because we want other people to enjoy what they're doing and make the best of it.
On the other hand, if you're struggling and you're thinking about leaving, a leave of absence is a viable option. I know at least 3 people, Zack included, in our department who have taken a leave of absence. 2 of them at least thought they were quitting. Actually, we're not taking a year off, we're quitting. But the department required them to take a leave for a year. And 2 of them came back and either changed labs or changed projects or said, the real world actually sucks. Maybe I should revisit grad school. Or, I don't have the credentials I want to do the kinds of things I want. Or now that I've taken some time to not be quite so burned out, actually, I'm more excited about my project, and then finished up their degrees. So if you're struggling, that's a possibility. You can go away and think about it and come back again. And that's not a deal breaker.
Yeah. So it's really important to think about the course you're on right now and figure out the ways to change or strengthen what you're doing.
Yeah, always evaluate your current status in the context of where you've been and where you want to go. And if you realize you're not happy with what you're doing, do something to change it. Don't just try to continue on and persist.
And it is really easy to get wrapped up in the minutia of grad school. No matter what department you're in, you have courses or research or teaching things, and every day is very busy. And so stopping to reflect about what you want and whether the life you want is attainable to you in the path you're on, or what you need to do to get it, is a valuable thing that probably all of us should do more often.
Thanks to Nikhil, Abigail, and our special guest, Zack Donnell. We're active on Twitter at PhD Podcast. If you'd like to help boost our visibility, please consider sharing the show with your friends or rating us on iTunes. We'd appreciate all the honest feedback, questions, and comments you're willing to send our way. As always, you can find this week's show notes and all the information I just mentioned at phdinprogress.com.
If you have something that you're interested in, don't wait, just start on it.
Thanks for listening.